Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. We have an awesome show for you this week. Lots to talk about. We're going to talk about the Honda Prologue Elite and its long-lost sibling, the Chevy Blazer. Associate Editor Byron Hurd and I traded off the Blazer a few weeks back, and I literally just got out of the Prologue. Byron's been in the S60, which is a car that he's been in for a little while, and he also spent a lot of time in our former long-termer. We've got a little bit to talk about with the Volkswagen GLI. Then we'll break down some news this week. The Hyundai Vision N74 appears to likely, maybe, probably, kind of, sort of confirmed-ish, be headed for production. Talk about some other news out of Scout and the redesigned Nissan Armada. We have a kind of a fun little spend my money segment as well. With that, Byron, what is going on?
Hey, I'm in garage mode over here. I've got all my materials being delivered for my new garage build, which if any of you read my SL63 versus Chrysler Pacifica bit, this is my my midlife mecca that I'm chasing here. So getting ready to start construction on that here in the coming weeks and get ready to convert an existing 2-car into a 3 and enjoy this beautiful weather that we're starting to get here. The fall is coming to Southeast Michigan and I'm here for it.
I feel like it's a fake fall, to be honest. Like this early, we often get this kind of like the first week after Labor Day, it gets even colder than it should be. And then it'll be like 90 until probably mid-October, and then it'll snow. But this has been darn near perfect. It was like 48 degrees at the back of the yard as I looked at my phone and let the dog out this morning. But it's going to warm up. I think it is going to be close to 80 later. So the leaves are turning. I played golf last weekend, and I was losing balls right and left into brightly colored yellow and orange trees. Not totally yellow and orange, but they're getting that kind of tint to them. So
yeah, it's starting.
It's starting. You ready for some cider?
Yeah, cider, donuts, fall beers. Give me some pumpkin beers and some Oktoberfests, and I'm a happy man.
I'm not the biggest pumpkin beer guy, but like for a couple weeks in October, if it's the right one, sure, all day.
Yeah, I never used to be, and just I don't remember what it was that turned me on. It was just something someone served to me in a bar and said, "Hey, trust me," and you know what? I did. So here we are.
That's actually how you can get into a lot of different beers, is you get it off draft and you're like, oh, okay, that was really good. That was cold. Maybe it was your third beer of the night and it tastes a little better than it should have, and you know, hey, you go down that rabbit hole.
Uh-huh.
All right, so we've got the Chevy Blazer and the Honda Prologue Elite. For those of you that don't know, genetically, these are very similar. They are under the skin, the same thing. And then after, like, basically GM did the work on this, and then Honda and Chevy each received a crossover, is how it worked out. I just got out of the Prologue. It was the Elite trim. It was all-wheel drive. It had... the EPA range rating was about 273 miles, pretty powerful, 288 horsepower. And again, it was dual motor, all-wheel drive. It was pretty loaded up too with the Elite trim. So, you know, lots of like heated seats, you know, nice, relatively nice leather interior. 21, I think, were the wheels. They look pretty cool. And it was this kind of like coastal teal, green, turquoise color. So really attention getting. I really like the design. I usually in these sort of like joint ventures is not the right word here, but like tandems, there's one I like a lot more than the other. And this one I'm a little bit torn. I really like the Equinox. I did the first drive of it back in late May. And I like the styling of that, but I also like the Honda sort of styling here too. It's very minimalist. It's very Honda. Sort of like a modern interpretation of its 1980s look, which I think is good, still in keeping with the times. So I liked it. I did a fair amount of driving in it this weekend. I took it from close to 300 miles topped off to about 100 when I left. So, you know, that tells you. But it was pretty good. Yeah, I liked it overall. One major flaw. The infotainment did not work the whole stinking weekend. I, did all the tricks, hold the power button down for 5 seconds, turn the car off, turn the car on, get in on the car, get out of the car. So it just appears we got a glitchy one in this specific tester, but did not encounter that with the Equinox. I will say GM infotainment is generally slightly better than Honda infotainment. That's definitely a broad statement, but I would kind of put it that way. So mini review of the Prologue, got a lot of golf clubs in it, picked up a buddy. We went down to Rouge Park, which is a little your general area. Played golf, played 18 down there, and we got 2 sets of clubs in there. Car seat fit in the back. It was a little tight, not too bad. You know, groceries, soccer balls, all that other good stuff too. It was comfortable. And the regen braking was, that was not nothing. The passengers really noticed that. Everybody, whether they are used to being in press cars with me or not, they were like, whoa, hey, that's pretty quick off the line as you would expect. And outside of the infotainment, I did like the vehicle overall. So, yeah. So you have spent some time in the Blazer, which we traded a few weeks back. You know, again, under the skin, they're the same thing. You know, what do you think of the Blazer? Do you think you would have a preference between these two?
Having not driven the Honda yet, it's kind of hard to say for sure. But I did actually enjoy the Blazer quite a bit. We're kind of reaching the point now where people have sort of normalized EV acceleration, and I feel like the mid and lower trim Blazers are kind of a real good look into like what we can expect from typical EVs going forward, where like, sure, there's tons of torque and you can get moving. It doesn't have that like neck snapping, inside rearranging feeling that you get from like an SS or from some of the other EVs. So it's a little more kind of an everyday kind of feel to it. I actually like it. I think it's a good, you know, throttle application, if you want to call it that, even though it's, you know, electronic and everything's weird. But I did actually enjoy driving it quite a bit. The general, just like the seating position, like the adjustability of the front seat, actually that was one of the better ones I've actually from a GM vehicle in recent memory. So I was actually surprised by how quickly I was able to find a comfortable seating position in that car. Even in my own car, I'm a Cadillac, and I struggle sometimes to fix that whenever I have to like go through and redo the memory settings or something like that. Actually getting my seat position right, like if I worn a helmet or something like that and had to, you know, change it and didn't have the memory set, it can take me, you know, an hour or so driving before I actually feel like I've got it back to where it's supposed to be. But with the Blazer, it was like a 2-minute ordeal, in and done, everything adjusted and ready to roll. It feels like a very ergonomically put together car, and the electric powertrain is what it is. I mean, that's either your jam or it's not. So, you know, we're kind of reaching the point where you can really kind of choose your own adventure with this stuff. We're not so much limited by what's practical. We're just kind of limited by preference. So, and cost, of course, you know, as evidenced by the Equinox situation. You just mentioned you were on the Equinox EV first drive, and I just did the Equinox ICE first drive. And, you know, between the two of them, like if you look at them, they you know, they look like they're both an Equinox, but they're completely different vehicles beyond, you know, the basic, you know, branding and marketing of them. And so, you know, you're paying a good 30 to 40% premium to get into the electric over a base gas model. And the gas models now are not very diverse. You're getting a pretty finite selection. You can't get Super Cruise in the gas. You can only get that on the Equinox EV. So like we're starting to see like where the differentiation is and like cost and tech and stuff like that, and where their buyers are for each. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes. And Blazer's in kind of a weird spot because Chevy already gave up on the whole notion of making it like an off-road vehicle again. So, you know, they've got other space to play in if they're going to do that kind of thing. So it's kind of interesting to see like, does Blazer remain like an EV focused platform going forward, or does it just kind of like serve a stopgap and then kind of make way for something either more interesting or something more mainstream the next generation? It's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's really interesting how sort of flooding the zone, Honda or Chevy, and to a lesser extent, I think even Honda are in the segment with ICE vehicles, with EVs. They're working together on, you know, a couple here. So it's definitely a part of the market where when I went on the Equinox drive, they really talked about how just in this segment, as in like that sort of compact, mid-size, and then everything in between segment of crossover, more is more. That was Chevy's approach. They're like, we want to grow our volume. We think we're going to grow the segment. yada, yada, yada. That was their thing, is just, we're going to throw everything, all the spaghetti at the wall that you can think of. So, I mean, so obviously when it comes to ICE and EVs, you have choices here. The Equinox, I think, is a little more basic, and then you get but you can dress it up plenty. Then you get the Blazer and the Prologue, which are, genetically about the same under the skin. And the Equinox is an Ultium-based product as well. It's just like shorter wheelbase, and a little more basic. But I do like the design of that one. So the one thing that I guess I was conflicted going back to the Prologue was, while I like the interior, frankly, a little bit more in some ways than the Chevys, because the Chevys are very Chevy. They're like, you can almost feel the Corvette and Camaro themes, which it looks good, but I almost like the minimalistic Honda approach a little bit more, just if I'm going to live with it, but also as in the Elite. So when you're in a nice trim like that, which it starts at like 47, I think, you're definitely, the minimalistic interior can definitely look about as good as it can look, So,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess, do you have a preference of, you've seen them both? I know you haven't driven the Prologue, but from a design perspective, Blazer is very in your face. It's got those, the angled fender flares. It's almost like scalloped, comparing it to a 68 Charger is a bit, hyperbolic, but you can probably see what I'm doing there. And then the Honda is much more Honda. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I go with the GM on this one. I like the way the Blazer looks. I mean, it's not a segment I have any personal interest in, so it's hard for me to get excited about any of them. But at the same time, if I had to look at one of them, I think that's the one I'd pick. And the interior, Chevy's, well, GM in general is just so close to nailing so many of these interiors. There's just weird little things here and there that either make you scratch your head, or it seems like lateral progress, if you want to call it lateral anything progress, but just things still having the manual low switch for the transmission on the steering wheel, just because it doesn't fit on the little toggle in the ICE Equinox, little weird anachronistic things like that, where it's just okay, this made sense in my 2001 F-150. Why are we still doing this in 2024? And so it's just, they're so close. But Honda kind of does the same weird little things. Well, not the same things, but similarly weird things. Like the tiny little digital clocks and stuff like that. They look like they're straight out of 1989, but with slightly more LEDs than they had back then. There's just weird little things like that. I feel like that hold both of them back in different ways that would bug me a little bit as an owner. And I mean, there are things in my car that bug me as an owner. They're just small enough that I don't care that much. And I feel like for most owners, this is the same noise level type of complaint. But I think they're both 99% there in just strangely different ways.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And again, it was tough for me to get a total read on the overall Prologue experience, because again, the infotainment didn't work. All I could do was voice control, the radio stations I happened to know, their call signs or whatever all weekend. Right. So that was a little frustrating. And I really like the Blazer too, for me to circle back on that. I had it for a couple days. I think we both drove it mid-August now, as I look back on it. Really attractive crossover, fun to drive. It got plenty of attention too. It is a little bit bigger than the Equinox. So I think, and there's plenty of room in the back seat. That was another area that I was impressed with the Blazer. That was cool. I think I went golfing in the Blazer too. I'm really taking my golf game up a level as these final weeks of summer or early fall are winding down. Fun to drive though. It looked really good. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's the Blazer to me is almost like the halo for Chevy in this part. And then the Equinox is hey, we also have this one, if maybe the Blazer you want isn't available, or, that type of thing. So, yeah, I like them both. I think it's a good opportunity for Chevy to really hit the EV segment about as hard as it can. And, they mentioned, hey, they're trying to, as Mary Barra, their CEO, has said, they want to be one of the leaders in the segment. Whereas I think Jim Farley at Ford, they're they're taking more of a nuanced approach with hybrids. They still have like the bookend EVs with Mach-E and the F-150 Lightning, but they've kind of backpedaled. Whereas Chevy, I think, at least still tries to be going full bore. Although they've been talking hybrids too. I just less specifically would be, a way to look at it. Um, Side note, in the Blazer, I did a hot lap with it with at Oakland County Sheriff. It was part of the Equinox event. They were just like, we want to give you guys a chance to drive the Blazer. I think I just rode in it. This is before I drove it. And he was one of the guys who, tested police cars for like 40 years. So we were like just blasting like straight at cones, then doing like, 90-degree turns, and like the tires were done by the time we were done with that. And they were done in police car livery, which is cool. Which illustrates that Chevy is going to put the Blazers in the police fleet. And I think it would be good for that. Again, that back seat is, if you find yourself in the back seat of a Chevy Blazer EV and it's, you maybe had an interesting night, if it's a police car, but there's plenty of room back there. So if you need to call your lawyer or whatever. So
Right. Well, and we just saw there was a story floating around. I don't know whether we actually ended up covering it or not now in hindsight, but something out of Menlo Park, we're talking Silicon Valley here, where a police department had independently gone out and purchased Teslas to use to see if they would work for their officers as, typical like squad cars, patrol cars. And the answer was they don't work very well. So there is some demand out there. Maybe it's all, in Silicon Valley, maybe it's not, for EV based law enforcement vehicles. So, Chevy, obviously all the domestics have a history of going after that market. So it's smart of them to try, even if it's, if it's something that's only going to be limited engagement, at least they're putting the effort and the development resources into it now, rather than just showing up late to the party with something, which is never good.
All right, well, let's shift gears, although EVs don't really have geared transmissions traditionally. You were in the S60, which I think I actually avoided driving that because like a tree fell in front of your house. So I stayed in another GM EV, the Hummer 3X, for the whole weekend, which was cool. But that meant you got a little more time to reflect on the S60. And I know one of the first press cars you drove at Autoblog was our long-termer, which you then got to keep, I think, for like a month, because it happened to be the car you were in at the very start of COVID. So it was more than a month. You just had that car for the spring of 2020. So what are your memoirs of the past and present S60?
Well, I got to say that the refresh that the car received after we had our long-term vehicle did help. The biggest complaints I think we had about the S60 were kind of the lack of like sportiness to it. Like we did have the option to go for like the Polestar engineered suspension and stuff like that at the time, as I recall, but we wanted to do the Inscription model because we liked the interior design better, the crystal shifter and all those kinds of things. And the one that I just drove was an Inscription. The one we originally had was I forget what the white color was, but it was a nice pearl white. This one is like a garnety red, very, very pretty. In fact, the finish I would probably pick for the car. And really like driving it with the updated infotainment OS and all that didn't really feel all that different, just because Volvo kind of stuck to their aesthetic with everything and they handled that transition pretty gracefully. The problem is like the infotainment itself wasn't super spectacular to begin with, and I wouldn't necessarily think any of us would call it super spectacular now. So consistency, sure, but maybe not so much marks for improvement. But in any case, like most of the stuff about the car, like the refinement of the powertrain, which we had some issues with, it is the plug-in hybrid. And for a long time, it was really kind of noticeable when the ice kicked in over the electric motors, especially at low speeds. The engine was pretty coarse. They've improved that quite a bit. The engine is still noisy. You do hear it when it comes on, but it's not quite as violent as it used to be, unless you're really demanding a lot of power from it when the state of charge is low, because it seems to kind of delay kicking in the electric motors a little bit when you really floor the pedal in that situation. So it's still not 100% there, but it's pretty good. And there's some other little like issues with the car where it's kind of feeling a little long in the tooth. Like the little cell phone holder is no longer big enough to fit my cell phone, and I still use a very low profile case. In fact, right now I don't even have a screen cover on it. So, and it's a big Samsung Galaxy, the only ones, the really expensive ones that were actually available during all the shortages a couple years ago. So literally the best phone I could have bought, not by choice, but it's what was available. And I can't fit it in any of the cubbies of this X60. So my old phones fit perfectly, and my work iPhone still just fits in the cubby, but the larger phones no longer do. And I mean, the S60 is being discontinued, so we're not going to see any improvements to any of this stuff. This is all just kind of like, final notes, sayonara. But it was a great little car, and I really enjoyed driving it again. Having a chance to actually get behind the wheel one last time was kind of a nice little, way to kind of put a bookend on the S60 for this generation, like having the long-termer and then getting to see it one last time here before it's completely out of production was pretty nice. So a good little car. It still does all the things we liked about it really well, and it still has pretty much the same flaws that we left it with.
Yeah, I've always liked the S60. I think it's an interesting design play. I think it's, it fits somewhere in a different space than some of, the Germans and obviously American premium cars and, all the other, automakers out there. And I've liked that. The interiors have that, understated sort of elegance. Did yours have the Orifice crystal shifter?
It did.
Awesome.
And the
you can't get one without it, right?
Right. And then the canvas interior, the wool interior too, which looks really sharp. It was, like a light, like a dock shoe blue. It was just very, very subtle on the inside, and it really worked against the red on the exterior.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. Sounds good. Do you think, if you were in the market in the segment, where would you put this one?
I enjoy driving this car day to day more than like that the 3 Series plug-in that we had. It feels a little less off and on than the BMW did. The BMW had even more pronounced of kind of a power on, power off situation when you were adding ICE to EV, and vice versa, kind of depending on what situation you were encountering. I don't know that there's really anything else in the segment that would interest me as much as either of those. I mean, there's just not much out there in terms of like plug-in sedans.
Yeah.
And fair. Like with this one going away, I mean, it's pretty much, the segment's kind of drying up in a way. Although I think we're going to see a revival of it here in the coming years with, EVs kind of looking like more of a long game and plug-in kind of maybe having a bit of a moment here. So, we could see this segment expand more. I think like Genesis could have some fun here if they wanted to, if they decide to actually, play around with plugins in their luxury space. I mean, Hyundai's got plugins galore, so no reason why Genesis can't do the same. So, there's opportunity here, but I think Volvo did it really well. And I mean, like the price point for that car never really got scary, even with the COVID price hikes and everything. So it really kind of goes out in a pretty sweet spot.
Yeah, when I think of things that you could cross shop this with, our long-term 3 Series that we, let go, I guess it's been a year ago, kind of comes to mind. But there is, again, to your point, not a lot of options in there. So I also think if you don't happen to be at a Volvo dealer before this thing hits the end of its run, I think it's a solid used car too, to be honest. If you want to, you're thinking electric, but you want to do hybrid, you're like, okay, maybe we'll do plug-in, and you like Volvos, it's definitely a nice sort of gateway vehicle for that. And, Volvos are okay with their residuals. I don't think you'll get sick of driving it. I've generally liked the S60. Even at prior car magazine stops, we've had long-term S60s. It seems to be the thing that everybody does. And, even like the regular ICE versions, people like them,
Yeah, especially if you're, a little concerned about the longevity of the plug-in version, given that it essentially only got one generation. There's not a lot of data out there to show how well it's going to do long term. The turbo models, to your point, are a perfect compromise. And I mean, you're losing a lot of weight. I mean, the plug-in weighs 4,000 some odd pounds. It's not a light car. So, losing the battery and the electric motors saves you some weight, be a little more nimble. You don't get the plug-in benefits, and you don't get the, the EV drive mode that you get from that. But I mean, it's a great little car, handles reasonably. It's not it's not going to beat a 3 Series around a racetrack or anything like that, but it's pretty competent for what it is. You'll enjoy driving it if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But, it's for the most part just a very practical luxury car that just hits all the stylistic notes.
All right, so tell me about this Volkswagen GLI you were in. And I was in very briefly. I went and got Thai food with it, and that's all I did.
Yeah, that was the Volkswagen was delivered to us with an issue, and unfortunately, it made it difficult for us to enjoy it. But not Volkswagen's fault; it was the car itself. So a couple of things I will note that the transmission, the shifter feel in that car was not amazing, and a letdown even compared to the GTI, which was already kind of like falling behind a bit the last time I drove one. But it just felt like it was overly notchy when you didn't want it to be, but didn't really have any heft to it, which was kind of like a weird, obnoxious combination of like, it doesn't feel very substantial, but it always feels like you have to slam it home to get it to go anywhere. The interior, like the hybrid of the updated infotainment, but the not full like interior overhaul works fine, I suppose. My biggest complaint was probably trying to get a good seating position, and in a manual transmission that matters a lot because you want to get your your clutch throw and everything right, and getting that right in that car was a little trickier than I'd remembered with previous Volkswagens. Volkswagen and seating position are two things that kind of always felt synonymous to me. Like I never felt like if anything else was wrong with a sporty Volkswagen, I knew I'd be able to find a nice low slung place to sit my butt, and I just couldn't quite get that right in the GLI. So I don't know. I didn't have that same problem with the car the last time we drove it, and I don't think they've changed anything about the way the seat mounts to the car or the shape or the adjustability of the seat itself. So I'm not sure why it was suddenly such a big problem for me, but it was. So brief time in that, unfortunately, just that's life and the timing of everything we've been dealing with this summer. But one we'd certainly love to be able to revisit down the road, sans the issues we had with it that made it difficult to drive. So
yeah, I mean, I literally went to Saitai, which is not far from where I need to go, and I stalled it like at least twice. Just the clutch feel was so, I don't know. It sure seemed like somebody. I don't know what you think. I don't know if somebody had a good track day with this thing or what they did, but that clutch was pretty in bad shape.
Yeah, I got the impression that someone had maybe already had to replace it, or that in the course of inspecting it for delivery at the dealership did not realize that adjustments had not been set at stops, and it just seemed to be coming out of adjustment. So we're talking like clutch throw and engagement here, which can get dicey in a manual transmission car. So if it kind of feels like your engagement point is wandering on you, that's no fun. So it was an exciting day and a half with that car.
Yeah. And the interesting thing here too is you have so many choices in this segment. I mean, so this is the Jetta GLI. To be clear, you could basically for very similar money still look at like a Golf GTI or something. Hyundai's got things for you, and if you want to spend more money, you could step all the way up to like the Type R or something, or even I think I'd probably go with, tell me if I'm crazy, a Honda Civic Si over this. And even just go totally different segment too, look at a Charger or look at a Mustang. And I think there's other ways to have your fun. Clutch aside, I did like the aesthetics of the car. It was a decent looking car, nice interior. They had some kind of nice design cues, just throughout. It was an overall good execution. But that's like the second thing we've talked about on the podcast, where there was like a sort of fundamental like functionality issue, which is weird. We don't see that in press cars very much, do we?
Yeah. And honestly, like just thinking about this car and then the long-term WRX that we have, like that's a pretty good, I feel like there's a lot of enthusiasts who'd be looking at the two and like, do I really need all-wheel drive? Do I, really care about the extra fuel economy I might get with the GLI from day to day? And I think it really actually comes down more to, can you get your head around one interior or the other more than anything else? I mean, if all-wheel drive's a necessity for you, then the Subaru is your choice, and it's good enough in every other way that I would not discourage people from getting it if all-wheel drive is that important. But if you look at it like as just two somewhat practical sports sedans, the interior, I think, is really what's going to sell both. And I think like it's kind of a toss up where you have Volkswagen like not quite nailing this whole what's going to be digital and what's going to be analog thing versus Subaru, which has pretty much stuck with analog for the most part, but the infotainment is just meh. It's fine, but I mean, if you can use your smartphone, you should, is pretty much where I land on that. So it's an interesting kind of spot. And the Subaru is generally going to be cheaper trim for trim, I'm pretty sure, unless something has changed drastically in the last couple of years. I don't believe it has. So,
interestingly, Volkswagen was among pioneers is maybe a little heady, but early adopters for making their vehicles hit Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. I remember a Tech of the Year back in 2014, a very cold October morning. I was shooting a video with our senior producer, Chris McGraw, and we were like, in 2014 is like, okay,
10 years ago.
Star Wars is playing it up, but we're sitting there, like he's got the camera on. I'm like messing around with my phone and trying to get it to work. So, Volkswagen kind of has taken that, path though. They were always like, I think to a certain extent, they're like, use Android Auto or use your phone or Apple CarPlay. I feel like that's kind of their ethos. So, all right. So there we go. Let's shift over to the news section. The whole will they, won't they, is it going to happen? Will it not? The Hyundai Vision N74. I saw some people basically say it's a go. It stopped me if you've heard this before. Hyundai at times has then taken the sort of unusual step to deny it, but then you'll see like another corporate person in a different part of the world will confirm it, which I think speaks to the global nature of Hyundai's business. But right now, looks like it's a go. It showed up in a presentation of future products. You can read our story from Jonathan Ramsey. It's on the site, and it's in there. Part of launching 21 models by 2030. There it is, right in there with the Genesis Magma. So, and there's some other cool stuff in here too, like the affordable EV. There's some things in this presentation that you might want to, look into a little more closely. But hey, the 74, it's a throwback. It's, this like sporty thing. It takes cues from like a Giorgetto Giugiaro concept from back in the day. I wrote a column on this saying, hell yeah, they got to do it, but ditch the fuel cell side of it. Still not totally clear on all of the details, but if this is true, I think they should do it. I 100% agree. What do you think?
I'm with you. And honestly, like here's a good opportunity to do something exciting with the plug-in. Like you throw away the fuel cell thing, which is kind of like a weird plug-in of its own sort, and you do this. And like we've already seen talk of like range extended electric vehicles from that side of the shop too. So there's the potential for like lots of different tech they can do with this. So you look at this car, it's on this massive platform that's already been designed to carry a large battery. So you could take a lot of that battery space away, save some weight, throw in a small ICE engine to do your supplementary work, and you've got a flagship plug-in that looks like that. That's pretty freaking cool. And I think that's a good place to go with plug-in technology if you actually want to make something out of it, especially since it's something that's going to be big and heavy anyway. It might as well be big and heavy and something you can sell to people, because if it's just big and heavy, that doesn't get you anywhere. So,
yeah,
that's my thing.
Yeah, I think for me, this is it's all going to be about the design. I think it's got to be. You look at some of the other sports cars and other muscle cars. The engine is always important, and I think of going back to like Camaros and Corvettes and Mustangs, which nominally this could compete with, but it is something different. But anything in the sporting segment, I do think it's relevant. And there is a little bit of like sort of pony lineage, when you look at some of, Hyundai's history. But to me, the design is what's going to get people just, their minds, totally, get just totally mind blowing here. So I think this is a good call. I really do. I think, Hyundai's always trying to get, I think, itself at the forefront of conversations like this and lead them. I think they're very good at entering a segment and doing it very well, not just the sports car segment, but like, look at the Palisade, things like that. The soon to come electric version of that, even like going back to the Sonata, it took them about a decade or so to get it to a more place of prestige. But when they did, it won all kinds of Car of the Year awards, and people really liked it. So I think this is a great thing for enthusiasts everywhere.
Yeah, and I mean they've got this great throwback shape, and
Yeah.
you can do all sorts of like weird DeLorean adjacent things with it. Like if this thing makes crazy weird noises and has like steam popping out of it and stuff like that, people are going to go nuts. And that's exactly kind of the thing you need from a car like this. Like this should be full on nostalgia. It should be silly and stupid, and like make it a Hyundai Hellcat. Like just make the thing fly. I mean, not literally fly, not full Back to the Future, but like just make it fast, make it stinking fast in a straight line, and then nobody will care how heavy it is. You get kill two birds.
Well, I mean, the same guy designed the DeLorean as well. That was also a Giugiaro car. So Hyundai, it's interesting because a lot of times they obviously don't have as long a history as, say, Ford or Mercedes, but I think it is cool that they can at least go back to 1974 and dust off a concept and say, hey, look at this, I mean, because frankly, there's not all that many people that remember, the Model T at this point, even though it's certainly ubiquitous and everyone knows what it is. But I mean, you go back to the 70s, and that's still a pretty long time ago. But you also have that idea that's still a little more, I think, at the front of people's brains to say, hey, okay, this is cool. That's even how I was sort of associating with the design of the Prologue, as it was more like an 80s sort of vibe. But also, design is subjective, and maybe you see what you want to see at times, but that's okay. I mean, I guess since we're talking about the 70s and 80s, it's a good time to talk about Scout. You actually went on, I think, the first and only Scout press trip. We've got a reveal date coming up where they're gonna, show their two new vehicles. They're still way out as far as production, like the year after. But it's circle your calendars, October 24th. I'm going to be seeing what Scout's doing on that day. So I don't really know exactly where I'll be, but I will definitely try to check out these new vehicles. To me, this has a little bit of a, I'd almost put it up there with the excitement of like Rivian's sort of surprise and delight reveals from, I think that was February or March. So, again, this could be a sort of competing with some of the Rivian things. So I'm excited to see what these things look like. Speaking of exactly what you just said, retro throwback, get people fired up. I think that's what this is going to be.
And I think, it wasn't that long ago that on the podcast we were talking about Rivian and Volkswagen, their tie-up. Mm-hmm. And so, Volkswagen's into Rivian because they want software. And we're talking like the fundamental software that's making their EVs work, Rivian's EVs in this case. So we've got Rivian being invested in by Volkswagen. Scout is an offshoot of Volkswagen. Scout is doing this thing theoretically kind of on their own. They're treating it as like its own entity. It operates kind of the way Porsche does versus the rest of the Volkswagen group, where it's essentially its own entity that does its own thing. Obviously, financially, it's tied to Volkswagen, but it operates sort of as its own business unit. And the tie-in with Rivian feels so bang on for these two, because we heard that like this started even before I went on that trip to South Carolina in earlier this year. They've been in talks since January. I think we're going to see not just our first look at what Scout's going to offer, but we're going to see the first hints of what Rivian's bringing to the table beyond just software. Because that's what the deal was ostensibly about. They came out and said, yeah, it's about the software. We want that. We're going to continue to build our own vehicles independently of each other, blah, blah, blah. There's no plan to intertwine anything beyond the software business. And I think that's, politely crap. I think we're going to see a much stronger tie-in between these two based on necessity. Because at this point, with the EV landscape looking the way it does right now, Scout is either going to have to either wildly over-deliver and come in cheaper than expected to really gain traction, or they're going to have to scale or find ways to do things that are EV. And they're not really in a position to do either of those on their own beyond the amount. Volkswagen's got tons of cash, sure. But if you look at what's happening in Germany right now, Volkswagen's manufacturing situation is not amazing. And they're probably not going to want to just throw money at this little US experiment that's happening with Scout unless they can actually see the ROI. So I think that by the end of the year, whether we find this out in October or we find it out, a little farther down the line, that either there's going to be some mechanical tech sharing between the two of them, or we're going to see something else from Scout leaking in from Volkswagen Group, some sort of plug-in, something that is electrified but not pure electric. Because as we stretch on, and we were kind of told we were going to see these things in the summer, it's now turning to fall, so it's not strictly delayed. I don't think they promised we'd see them literally in the summer, but we were told, you'll see it in the summer. So we're reaching into that territory. It's like, okay, like, why didn't we see it when they hinted at why, what's going on with it? There's going to be more to this announcement, I think, than just here's our truck and here's our SUV. So that's my kind of long way around to saying, like, I feel like this Rivian thing is bigger than Volkswagen's letting on, than Scout is letting on. And like, it's really worth looking at from an enthusiast perspective, because like, we're looking at kind of like the future of enthusiast off-roading brand in the US, because Jeep is in a really weird place right now. Recon has been announced but not launched, and it's supposed to be on sale next year. And meanwhile, like, their entire US executive team retired. So they've replaced them with new people who are now kind of in charge of carrying this new electric torch. And we haven't really heard or seen a whole lot from them. Obviously, we were individually not invited to Easter Jeep Safari this year, which is traditionally when those kinds of things would have been discussed. But then not much came out of Easter Jeep Safari to begin with. So it really kind of feels like there's a lot of dead air coming out of Stellantis, coming out of Jeep. And so someone's going to step up and fill that void. And Scout Rivian's in a great spot to do it. Ford seems to, I'm not going to say they've dropped the ball on doing a hybrid Bronco, because they never really promised to do one to begin with. But they've been dealing with so many issues with getting Bronco production scaled up that they haven't really had a time to like go and do anything experimental with it. So this is a weird kind of like potential inflection point for the whole 4x4 landscape. And I feel like Scout is maybe in the best position of anybody to take advantage of it. Let's see what happens,
That's a bold statement for a company that hasn't actually even built anything, that they're in a better spot than, say, Jeep. But I see what you're saying. I can sort of see the through line there. To build on what you're saying, Jeep is in a weird position. I'm doing a 5 thoughts on the Gladiator, which we've talked about a couple times on the podcast. But Gladiator sales are down. Wrangler sales are down. Jeep is having kind of a weird year. A colleague and friend, Mark Phelan at the Free Press, he's their auto columnist, had a really nice piece this weekend. He has usually like a Saturday auto column talking about like what is going on with Jeep, some of the sales struggles, the changes in leadership, the fact that they basically killed off a lot of their volume models at the lower end of the lineup. And then to your point, where is the Recon? Things are not getting here as quickly as they could. And, to me, this is almost like, a sleeping giant. It's like when, I don't know, pick your analogy, like a, dynastic sports team is always good. And then all of a sudden somebody else gets better and you can see their complacency maybe. So that to me is kind of sort of what's happening. And then, I'm literally in the Land Cruiser, which we'll talk about that probably on a future show. I can't wait to get in the 4Runner. I think that's going to be cool. The Lexus GX. I'm all about, if, the opportunity presented itself, considering a Rivian or a Scout, either one of those, as well as like the used market, used 4Runner, that's a great daily. Things like that. Well, maybe not a great daily, but a fun daily. So, to your point, this is as tough as it's ever been in the off-roader segment. And Jeep, they were just on top for so long with very little true competition, just given the disparate nature of their audience versus perhaps like Toyota and the Mercedes G-Class and all that stuff. So Ford comes in though with the Bronco and the Bronco Sport, which is, as you could read Zach's story on the Sasquatch, that's better than ever. And then you got all these new entries coming in. So Jeep cannot chill out, as they appear to have been doing. And, I drove the Gladiator again. I loved it. Fuel economy is not great, man. It's still pretty expensive, like Wranglers are cheaper on the used market, but you got to take a ton of miles. You start to ask yourself, why do I really want to do this? And there's other options for you. new and used. So,
Yeah,
man,
100%. And you look at it like, obviously, as a Jeep owner, like the
yeah,
ownership experience with those cars is really dependent on how much money you're spending,
yeah,
which is it seems like a very basic thing to say, right? But it's kind of almost inverse. Like the more you spend on them, the more you're going to be spending to maintain them, and you're kind of like lost in this sort of
yeah,
like never ending exponential growth of investment into your hobby. And it's one of those things that you either live with it as a hobbyist or you just move on from it. And I think Jeep has a lot of churn in that sense, that a lot of people buy Jeeps because they like the idea of driving a Jeep. They may not necessarily stick with a Wrangler after their first experience, just because you learn that we've progressed a lot since the 1940s in terms of ride quality and those things. And if you're comfortable being tossed around as a matter of course, then sure, you'll enjoy a Wrangler for the rest of your life. But at some point, you start to value your kidneys, and you think to yourself, "Hey, maybe I should drive a normal civilized vehicle." And then, of course, you can look at a Grand Cherokee, which is as civilized as they get. In fact, one of my favorite driving
yeah,
SUVs out there. But at the same time, you're staying in the same quality vertical, if you will,
yeah,
and the durability vertical. So you can only escape so far if you stay within the brand. But there's certainly an opportunity out there now, because I mean, if Scout wants to stay premium, that's fine. They can probably afford to do that if they think they can find buyers. But it's a weird kind of thing, like to expect both like the nostalgia folks and the EV folks to converge on a singular brand without some sort of other kind of hook. So it's a narrow kind of lane they're already traversing, and I think in a way, like the kind of unity between Scout and Rivian is the beautiful dichotomy of Scout being the off-road brand and Rivian being the on-road brand that can off-road. So like Scout is the hobby brand that you can take to work, and Rivian is the take to work that you can occasionally dab in a hobby. So they're kind of two sides of the same equation. If you think about it, they can balance each other out really nicely. And also, like they both kind of go at the same sort of like body on frame off-road mission, even if Rivian's body and frame is a little different from the way we would traditionally define them. Scout has only said they want to do body on frame. They didn't necessarily say it would be traditional body on frame. So, it doesn't have to be K5 style. It could be a little more Rivian style. We don't really know. But it's interesting, and a place where everyone can kind of afford to play, because it's such a popular thing. Like, everybody wants rugged, everybody wants big, and they're both in a position to deliver that. So why fight when you can cooperate?
yeah. And don't forget, they really needed each other too. Rivian needed Volkswagen's money, and Volkswagen needed Rivian's, electronic software architecture expertise. So, yeah, it's going to be very interesting, and I think it does sort of depend for the consumer. And I really encourage people who are looking at these things, you got to test drive them. I mean, it's a cliche, but I remember, to your point about Jeep's, on-road demeanor. Jeeps, I always think Jeeps are cool. I did one of an earlier press trip I did was on the Rubicon with the Wrangler. It was like a mid-cycle refresh launch. And I remember my dad, who was in the Army, like back in like, I think the 60s, and actually drove Jeeps. And he's like, "Are you out of your mind? You don't want to drive a Jeep?" And, it's funny. I can kind of see what he was saying. It's not a comfortable experience by any measure. So, you kind of got to know what you're signing up for in the off-roader. And that's where, maybe a Grand Cherokee might even be more your vibe. And it'll be interesting to see if Scout, Rivian, etc., go into like the Grand Cherokee segment.
Yeah. Well, and to your point too about like what you're comfortable driving is, you talk to a lot of race car drivers. Most of them don't get out of a race car and into a 911 GT3 RS to drive home. They might get into some sort of fancy supercar, but it's probably going to be something with an adaptive suspension, because they're sick of having their spines compressed over every single curb on a racetrack all day. They want to get into a Range Rover or something like that to drive home. You see that with athletes too. They want something big and comfortable they can spread out and just relax in. And so like, the fact that you can punish yourself all the time doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
And that's as a Jeep owner and the owner of a Slam sports car, I mean, I get it. Trust me, it's fun. But the older you get, the shorter the doses, because otherwise you feel it for too long.
I was on a test track with Sebastian Vettel. I will do a name check here. This was about
Nice.
11 years ago. It was an Infinity drive, and they were showing off their like steer by wire and some other tech. And it was cool. He was really ringing the car out around this, I think it was an old NASCAR track in like Kentucky, I think. It was like they made us drive up there from the Nissan base in Tennessee. And then we went to the race in Austin a week later or days later. It was awesome. But Vettel, I remember, even said, I said, well, what do you drive? What do you think? What do you think of this? You know, like, because what else do you ask Sebastian Vettel when you're sitting next to him? And he's like, no, man, I like to put it in comfort mode and cruise. He's like, I get all my speed. That's my job. He's like, people think I want to drive like a maniac. That's not true. It's like, I just want to like, you know, something comfortable and I want to just drive the car. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's funny. There's a lot of auto journalists that probably don't approach their daily driving or other, you know, just commuters that way. But maybe we should drive more like Vettel in his daily life. So, all right. Well, speaking of Infiniti, we'll jump over to Nissan real quick. There's a new Armada. Joel Stocksdale, our news editor, saw this. It's, you know, fairly, I think, credible redesign. If you look at it, it definitely looks, I think, sleeker in some ways. It's one of the more kind of almost bougie Armadas that I could have seen in a while. Some new trims. You get the Pro 4X, which is cool. I guess if you really want to go off-roading with a vehicle the size of, you know, I don't know, a small tank or something. But, you know, again, I feel like we say this all the time in the podcast, and it's almost like a trope. Yeah, this Nissan fill-in-the-blank vehicle, it really was old and it needed a refresh, and they did it, and it's a little bit better. And they added this cool trim. You know, sometimes it's like a Rock Creek or something for the Pathfinder. And it's a little bit better. It's more competitive. So, you know, I think that kind of sums it up here. What do you think?
I like it, honestly. I'm not super thrilled about the grille designs. They're all quite large, and I mean that is the trend these days. And I'm not super sold on them, but I actually really love the rest of the design, both inside and out. I think it looks really good. I just drove the QX80, which is, you know, mechanically related but not the same vehicle. And I think the Armada treatment's going to suit the platform a little bit better. I'm not entirely bought in on Infiniti's six-figure mission for the QX, and I feel like the Nissan will hit the sweet spot a little bit better because, I mean, you're still not getting the V8. It is what it is, but it feels like the perfect balance between like old school SUV and kind of a premium feel. And I towed with an outgoing Armada just a few years ago, and I really liked. I actually towed my Miata from Cleveland to Detroit when I moved here with an Armada, and that was a flawless experience. I was thrilled with how well that thing handled it. Obviously, a Miata is not a very taxing thing to tow, but still, it was a very nice experience. I've always liked this car. I've always liked the looks of it, and I feel like they've kind of continued on with this. So looks good to me.
All right, let's spend some money here. A friend of Autoblog is looking for a daily driver, looking to spend maybe $20,000 to $30,000, something like that, and you know, was looking at a Gladiator, maybe, you know, new or used, but regardless, you're going to be spending 40 to 50 grand on that without even breaking a sweat. It seems like Wrangler, maybe, but there's a lot of miles on those, at least in this price range. So another approach could be some sort of used BMW. The thought could be an older BMW 3 Series wagon, and by older, those go back a few years. I forget what the actual cutoff for that last generation was, but those are out there. They do have some miles, or just a more recent X3, which are a little more ubiquitous, a little more actually cost friendly, because it seems like people they're crossovers. It's not like people, I guess all the auto journalists are buying the 3 Series wagons. But what would you do in this segment? And, you see any good ones out there?
I mean, for me, the wagon is very appealing, especially like the smaller the wagon, the more I like it. It's kind of weird. Like the RS6 is a really cool Audi, but I don't see myself ever actually wanting to deal with driving one. But if they had an RS4 here or an RS3, that's my speed. Like RS3, love that. But again, we're getting kind of away from a wagon and into a hatch at that point. So for me, the sweet spot would be to go small. So a 3 Series wagon, you can get I think it was the 328i's back in the E90 generation, You could get those with a manual. I mean, you're going to need only the base engine, but still not a bad engine. Just not exciting by today's standards, but better than getting an auto in some cases. Although that said, they did have very good automatic transmission. I don't think BMW's ever really made a bad automatic in a 3 Series. So you really can't go wrong either way there. And I mean, with the X3, you certainly get something that's more everyday practical. Like as a sedan and sports car driver, I do sometimes get sick of the fact that I could never see more than one car in front of me. And when you're in a crossover, you have good visibility that you do not get in a low slung vehicle. So that is, I mean, a real consideration for people. For me, the wagon shape would sell it more than anything else.
Some of these, especially if you're willing to take some miles, like here's a decent 3 Series. It's an all-wheel drive, which is appealing. Looks like it's just at a dealership, which is kind of cool, for about 10 grand. It has a salvage title. We're going to X out of that real quick. But, there's some, wagons, they tend to get more close to like 20,000 if you want lower miles. And then the X3s, it's almost like you can get a pretty nice one for about the same price with a lot more, with some of the more modern infotainment, and the interiors look a bit nicer. We'll see. To your point, it's very appealing to have that like elevated ride height in the X3. It's just you're not in some off-roader, but you are, it's just a little more natural, especially with daily driving chores. So all right. Well, real quick, because my computer is about to do an update, whether I wanted to or not, you have a fall beer recommendation.
Oh, I am a complete basic sucker for Sam Adams Oktoberfest.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I will not apologize for it. It's just good, drinkable. But really, anybody's Oktoberfest, any kind of like amber, any kind of Märzen, like that hits for me. Like I like a slightly maltier take on kind of like a straight up lager. So.
Okay, I'll see your that Oktoberfest and raise you a Frankenmuth Oktoberfest. They do good beers. Their Old Detroit Amber Ale is another nice kind of October, November beer. Nice kind of garnet colored beer. Really hits right, especially in a glass. So, those are my recommendations and yours. Well, Byron, it's been good hanging out with you this week. If you enjoy the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to spend your money. That's podcast@autoblog.com. Shout out to Eric Meyer, who makes us sound good each and every week. We'll see you later.